Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. We're delighted, there you are, Ivan. We're delighted to have our own Ivan Eland back to speak to us tonight. For more than 3 decades, Ivan has enjoyed a distinguished career in Washington as a defense analyst at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, then at the Congressional Budget Office, at Cato, and now at the Independent Institute. And defense is really kind of an Orwellian term. Defense really means offense. It's the one part of the government that is immune from political competition. Since the Committee for the Republic began in 2003, Ivan has been a very valuable member of our board. He is the author of 10 original books, each inspired by his highly developed constitutional personality and citizen identity. His latest, hot off the press, and where are those books, Oliver? They're right in the back. We're available in the back. The 2 books are A Balance of Titans, and the second book is The Domestic Causes of American War. Now, Ivan sensibly makes the argument that most wars in American history were unnecessary. More bases, more treaties, more spending don't make us safe. Ivan tells us less is more. True to the committee's mission, Ivan wants to be a citizen of a republic which celebrates the rule of law and liberty and justice for all, rather than be a subject of an empire that celebrates the law of the jungle, where the strong do what they will and the weak accept what they must. Ivan is a constitutionalist to his very core. He's calling for Congress to end its 3/4 of a century abdication of its war power. Now, it goes without saying here at the committee, and Ivan is certainly no exception, that Ivan's views, as ours are a minority view in Washington today. Even though Ivan's views were a majority view, simply known as constitutional by our founding fathers. Ivan makes a strong case for cutting our defense budget in half and withdrawing from NATO and our Asian treaties. He lays out a detailed plan for restricting American military power to the Western Hemisphere. This would allow us to cut the Navy in half, the Army, Marines, and Air Force by 2/3, and eliminate our vulnerable land-based and bomber-based nuclear deterrent. Ivan believes the most vital national interest is the United States Constitution. That's why we love Ivan, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Ivan. Come on.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the Committee for the Republic for, letting me speak. I don't know if I need to now with that introduction. I think John pretty much summed up my views. Maybe we should just go right to question and answer. But sorry for my ear. It was just another failed assassination attempt. Actually, I had surgery this morning, but I'm fine. So it's much more mundane than that. Now, back on the counter, I have 2 books, and you say, well, you can't have 2 new books at the same time, but it just kind of, the vicissitudes of book publishing just sort of happened that way. Well, they came out with like about a month between them. But actually, for speaking about them, it's very good because the first one on the domestic causes of American wars, it's more of a history of the wars of the U.S. And I scratched the surface. We always talk about wars. What's the threat? What threat were we going after? But there was a lot of other stuff that we don't talk about, and that's what was happening here at home that spurred the war. And were these wars in the national security interest of the United States? maybe, but when you scratch the surface there, you sort of wonder. But they clearly were not good for the republic, because when you have a war, you have an erosion of civil liberties, you have a expansion of government, and also you have increased executive power. The executive branch now is pretty much the government. 99% of the employees work for the executive branch, and that includes the military, of course. And so these civil liberties have a track record of being usurped during war, because you got to get on the team. It's us or them. It's an all or nothing, unlike economics, which if countries trade, it's mutually beneficial. So it's a win-win situation. If you have a war, one side is bound to lose and one side is bound to win. Now, occasionally you get a tie or everybody gets exhausted or whatever and quits, but it's mainly a zero-sum game, or that's what's the end goal, is to subdue your opponent. The problem is during war, we become a lot more like our enemies, which we usually have at least an ideological, not always, but so we usually have at least a veneer of opposition, because they're either left-wing or they're a right-wing dictator like Saddam Hussein or whatever. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about both books, but I'm going to run through U.S. history. And one of the big items that the Republic stands for is that we would like Congress to fulfill the constitutional requirement to declare war. We did that up until 1950, and when John says it's been 3/4 of a century since we've done that, that's really true. And you'll see when I go through the history that this is much different. Also, what are U.S. vital interests? That has expanded from a very limited set before World War II, as recently as World War II, into a global muddle of what, does anyone ever ask what we should do? Now, if you read, I'll discuss Trump's national security strategy at the end of my talk, and he actually is a little bit better in defining it, but still at the end, he goes, well, we have to do this here and this there, and so you wonder if he's going to be committed to that. But, he is trying to limit it, I think, at this point, but I'll go into that when I get there. But so I'm briefly going to go through some of the wars. I'm not going to go through all the wars. We could probably get some of them in question and answer if I don't talk about them. But I just want to go and talk about, because some of the wars you probably have never heard of. The first war, and that's my first book, The Domestic Causes of American Wars. The first one is the Quasi-War with France. Well, when our country started, and even before that, the French and the British were fighting these wars, and we got caught up with them because our neutral trade, both sides were trying to, prevent our exports from getting to their enemies because they can be used in the war. Even foodstuffs were a war item in many cases. But the Quasi-War, I mention this because it was a simple war where the United States had been allied with France during the American Revolution. In fact, it's probably more accurate to say that we helped the French win our independence from Britain. And so we had this alliance, and George Washington, he was a Federalist, but after he became president after the war, after the American Revolution, he sort of became pro-British with Alexander Hamilton. On the other side was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And it's very interesting because in the Quasi-War, the Federalists, who were pro-British, were in power in the United States. And so they were very concerned about the French poaching our trade. But the French were mad because they felt that we were still allied with the French from after the American Revolution. And yet we just signed this treaty, which was very one-sided with the British, the Jay Treaty. So they started, and it really affected them because they had, the United States was allowing the British to attack their ships, and also providing a shelter in our ports for them. So they started attacking our merchant ships. Well, the only reason I mention this war is because it was the first war we had, and it's the prototype on how the war should have been run. The Congress doesn't have to declare war, and Congress is very nervous about getting involved in France, which was a very powerful country at the time, and we had a new type of government here. They were very nervous about that, so they were very strict. They passed 20 laws. Congress passed 20 laws on ship deployments, rules of engagement, everything. And the reason that they did this shows what the original concept was in America, was that the Congress had to declare war, unlike in Britain, the country that we got our independence from. The monarch had this power. He could declare war. And many of the other European monarchs had this power as well. And they would just declare war, and their populations would suffer in high taxes, and they would also be conscripted to fight in the war, the peasants and the common person. So when the framers framed the Constitution, they said, well, we want the people's houses to initiate war. Now, they changed it to declare war simply because, or at least according to Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention, they wanted the president to have a power. If we were directly being invaded, the Congress was out most of the year then because of the harvests and everything in the old days. Now the Congress can be reconvened in a moment's notice because of airplanes, cars, whatever. And it sits most of the time, but not back then. So what they did was they said the president needs this power in case we're attacked. He needs to, obviously can't sit there and do nothing. But but Congress is eventually going to have to approve whatever military action he takes, even defensive. But he does have the power to do that. And also, any offensive warfare, that's supposed to be approved by Congress. Well, that was the case with the quasi-war. They limited the activities to only defending our ships rather than attacking French ships. And as I said, the Congress was really involved in the deployments. And that's going to be a key because we don't do that anymore. We assume that, and we're way past that now. In 1950 was when we stopped declaring war. The last declared war that we had was in World War II. And Truman didn't get a declaration of war for a major war. That was a major change. And he, I think, became also the first imperial president because he had all these structures that they put in place in the National Security Act of 1947, which gave him his own intelligence agency. He didn't have to rely on the military. He didn't have to, you had a unified command in the Defense Department. He used to have secretaries of war and Navy, so he had easier to control the military. And he also had a new bureaucracy around the White House, the National Security Council. And so ever since 1950, they kind of thrown all the rules to the wind, and they don't follow the declaration of war. And I think that's one of the things that we would like here at the committee for them to start doing again. I personally think that's not enough. I think we should go back to where the Congress does deployments, controls deployments as well. And I'll go and give another example. This has been abused in the Mexican War, which was in 1946 to 48. And James Polk had a secret plan to conquer half of Mexico, which actually conquered 51% of it. And that's our Southwest, California. He wanted the ports in California. But what he did was he took the forces that Texas was just admitted to the Union, annexed. And so he took the forces that were sent down there to protect Texas, because Mexico was still mad about, Texas independence from about 9 years before. And so Polk, what he cleverly did was he took those forces and he put them in disputed territory. And actually the Mexican government had a better case that was their soil than the United States did. And what happened was the Mexicans, he then blockaded this port, which is relevant now since Trump just blockaded the Venezuelans, which has always been internationally an act of war. So actually, many people think Polk provoked the war, but actually started the war by blockading this port on the Rio Grande. And so what happened was Mexicans, they raided in this disputed territory, and Polk said, well, they're attacking us on our own soil, and so he asked for a declaration of war. The Congress, many people were suspicious of this, but they, of course, like Congress always does, they voted for it. And so, of course, he was able to manipulate this. There was a declaration of war, but he had deployed these forces in a very, an area that was prone to hostilities, which any present president can do the same thing, and they often do. We saw that in Vietnam. We saw that in, we saw it in the first Gulf War as well, Desert Shield. So they deploy these forces, and then there's a momentum to use the forces. Like the forces would deteriorate, the readiness would deteriorate in the desert and the Desert Storm, Desert Shield. So what happens, they use in Desert Storm. The same is true with these forces that are down in the Caribbean and right now. I mean, military forces, if you leave them on station, even the Navy, the readiness deteriorates. And there's now maybe there won't be any big action, but I think, when you put forces like that, everybody's expecting something to happen, right? Oh, Trump chickened out. We're going to get the Trump chickened out thing. And so the Congress also needs to control these deployments as well, I think. And they're constitutionally, they did it at the beginning of the country, but at the beginning of the history of the country, but they don't do it now. I mean, we've gone so much to, as John mentioned, congressional abdication of power. It hasn't been just the executive stealing power, it's been congressional abdication. War power is not the only thing. We don't do treaties anymore. Treaties require two-thirds Senate approval, and we don't do that. And in the just before the Mexican War, John Tyler set a precedent by the Treaty of Annexation for Texas. Instead of getting two-thirds of the Senate, which the Constitution says, he just said, well, we're going to annex it with a majority in either house, and that set a bad precedent. Now we do executive agreements, which aren't in the Constitution, and they're, who knows? Most of them don't go through Congress, and some of them are secret. So this is an abrogation of the treaty power. The budget, that's the key congressional power, and yet they've abdicated it. Congress still passes the budget occasionally, but well, yeah, the Budget Act is in bad shape, but they're supposed to pass it. But really what happens, even when they pass a budget, they putter around the edges of this massive, and it's just the size of the budget. Nobody knows, as I think David Stockman would agree with this. If anybody in the history of the United States, he probably knew the most about budget. But even he admitted he didn't know all about the budget because it's massive. And the $1 trillion is the defense budget, and that's even massive. So anyway, we go through this thing, and I'm stressing this because the committee is very concerned about this and has been for a long time, that executives can and it's not just Trump that's doing this. We've had this idea that he's murdering people in these boats. Well, we had that issue with Obama. They whacked al-Awlaki, who was an al-Qaeda member, an alleged al-Qaeda member, he probably was, and his son, and they were U.S. citizens, and so there wasn't a war. Now they had a authorization to go after al-Qaeda, the main al-Qaeda after 9/11, but then George W. Bush blew it into this worldwide attack on terrorism, which clearly people say, well, he had a resolution. I'm going, if you read the resolution, you're supposed to go over the perpetrators of 9/11, which was al-Qaeda, Afghan and Pakistan, and the people who were harboring the Taliban. but Awlaki wasn't in that group, that part of Al-Qaeda, and so they whacked him. So Trump is not the first person to do these things, but certainly it is alarming, and there's no war on, so what do you call it? I guess you have to call it murder, because that's what it is. If there's no declared war, then... some of the other wars, as we go along, I go into various domestic, but you see various things. The United States is a democracy, and we have election, and you see almost inevitably that there's that foreign policy revolves around the election, and this is and it also revolves around territorial acquisition, economics, and that thing. And I go through various wars to demonstrate that. One that's really stark is that the story on the public perception of the Cuban Missile Crisis is much different than the actual reality. Public perception is that John F. Kennedy faced down the Soviets and got them to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, the nuclear missiles that they placed there, and that he was a hero because he did that. Well, in reality, he had a secret deal, and this just came out, I don't know, in the last 10 or 15 years, that he also had to get rid of the U.S. missiles, which were on the Russian border in Italy, Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey. And he kept that a secret because he was weak, he was perceived as weak before he went into the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he had he had sponsored an invasion of Castro's Cuba that went bad, and he also had been bested at in the Vienna summit by Khrushchev. So it's really stark when you listen to the tapes of Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, and they're not talking about that. They were saying, well, these missiles in Cuba, they really don't change the balance. We still have nuclear superiority. I mean, we may be all annihilated 15 minutes earlier than we would be normally in any nuclear war, but they admitted that there was no strategic problem with these missiles. And Kennedy says, well, yeah, if I hadn't have said that if they put missiles there, it would be a grave threat to the United States, because I wouldn't have to do anything about it at all. And then they started talking about how he needed to be tough for the upcoming congressional election so that the party would do well in the congressional election. And I'm thinking, wow, if this happens when the world's is hanging in the balance, then you got politics in every national security crisis. And so I think that's very illustrative. So I go through the history, and there's many very surprising things about a lot of these wars that are not in the we have the historians would agree with a lot of this, but they're pro and con and all this kind of stuff. But the public, there's been a narrative to each one of these wars, and a lot of times the public narrative is not the same as what they're really discussing in academic circles about and the reality, I think. So now I go to the second book is more in the policy realm. Well, given all these problems with the wars that we have, most of them haven't been really done for national security reasons, if you dig down and deep, or they've been done for wars like grabbing Canada, the War of 1812, or grabbing Mexico, or half of Mexico in the Mexican War, these types of things. Then you get to, well, what should we be doing? Well, earlier in our history, up until World War II, we had a very limited idea of what were in our nation's vital interests. And basically, it was the Caribbean, the Western Hemisphere, and the Atlantic and Pacific approaches. And after that, of course, we went to a worldwide crusade on communism under Truman. And this has led to all sorts of problems with the republic here at home, which is the major problem with it. I mean, we were the winners of the war, but of course the British and the French, if you want to say we were the winners of the Cold War, mainly the Soviet Union collapsed because it had a bad economy. But let's say for the sake of argument, that we won the war. But the British were on the winning side of both two world wars, and their empire collapsed because of financial reasons, because they couldn't afford it. So we're faced with the same problem. We have a debt to GDP ratio that's now over 100%. We have $38 trillion worth of debt, and we have a $2 trillion budget deficit. And so I think we need to retrench and go back to what we did before the Cold War in limiting our vital interests, or what we think are our vital interests, and shaping our forces and our budget to do that. And my second book, A Balance of Titans, really advocates, it goes back to, I'm not the first person to think this up, Joseph Kennedy, who was an ambassador to Germany under FDR, he originally came up with this to try to avoid World War II. But then FDR, during the war, after the war had started in 1943, he was looking ahead to the post-war era, and he said, well, I'd really like to do the United Nations. He was thinking about Wilson's failed League of Nations before. But he said, we're not going to be ready for that. So FDR was more pragmatic than the idealistic Wilson. And he said, in the interim, what we should do is have the winners of the war, the great powers, Britain, U.S., Russia, and China, or Soviet Union and China. What we really need to do is have them police their own areas and then, cooperate. And so FDR, he had made peace with Stalin, and he realized Stalin was a monster, but during the war, he advertised him as Uncle Joe to humanize him. And certainly, Stalin was a tyrant at home, but tyrants at home are not always expansionist. And so what FDR wanted to do was have this more cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union, Britain, and China after the war to police their own areas, and then work out any transnational issues. So what I think the United States should do is, and I'm going to go over Trump's, it aligns a bit with Trump's national security strategy, although I'm going to point out where the differences are. And the problem with Trump is he always goes overboard, and the problem is with implementation. For instance, his first priority I don't agree with at all, and that is using military forces for law enforcement. That's not what they're designed to do under the Passa Comitatus Act of 1878. It's illegal to do that unless unless you invoke the Insurrection Act. And of course, there hasn't been an insurrection, at least not under his second term. But that's one of his first priorities. The second priority is the Western Hemisphere, and I think it's right to focus on that because that's the area that's closest to us, and there's problems here. But the problem is he approaches it from a neo-imperialist standpoint. Herbert Hoover and FDR had a good neighbor policy because the U.S. had been meddling around feudally, I think, in the 1920s. And so, and before that, Wilson had been meddling in Latin America, and everybody hated the United States. Well, the dictatorships were on the rise, and FDR wanted to make Latin America on our side during the war because he was afraid Hitler was going to create bases in Latin America that could bomb the U.S. They're closer than German bases. The bombers were, at the end of their tether, and if they were in Latin America, they'd be a lot closer. So he ran a good neighbor policy, and I think that's what you should do. You don't have to be a tyrant like Putin or whatever in your sphere of influence. So I think the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, but I just don't know what he's doing. Maduro is no threat to the United States in any way at all, and I don't buy the drug thing because he's pardoning, drug kingpins and stuff. So that doesn't add up. And even the roots of the drugs that he's hitting small boats is going to make absolutely no difference. So anyway, now we'll go to the third one is China. I think he's taken his foot off the gas with China a little bit, and I think that's good because I think the United States is probably going to have to let China rise. And I don't really think it's going to rise all that much because it's going more communist than it was. And I think Xi Jinping, from a national security, from the Chinese people's perspective, Xi Jinping is the worst enemy. From the U.S. national security standpoint, he should be our best friend because he's making China weaker with bringing back communism. And so I think taking off the gas on China is probably a good idea. Then we go to Europe. Trump is correct. The Europeans have been freeloading, and they need to do more for their own security. And I think he's finally got their attention. And I think that it's true with Ukraine. Now, I don't think we should have abandoned Ukraine. We chose a side, and if Joe Biden chose it, Trump probably should fulfill it. But I certainly don't think we should take the Russian side, but I do think he's right to transfer the responsibility to the Europeans for Ukraine, and also they need to do more for their own defense as well. Number 4, the Middle East. He says we don't need to worry about the Middle East as much because we have plenty of oil now with the fracking. I wrote a book called No War for Oil, probably, 15 years ago, which said we really didn't need to worry about Middle Eastern oil even back then because the free market is the cheapest way to get the oil rather than to buy all these military forces that are, guarding against something that may not happen. And even if it does happen, the market will adjust to it, which it has before. And then, let's see, the final inconsistency that Trump has is if he wants to lower emphasis on Asia, Europe, the Middle East, then we should be able to cut the defense budget, right? But he doesn't want to do that. He wants to increase the defense budget, which seems like if the Europeans are doing more, the purpose should be so that we don't have to spend as much money defending them. Same with Middle East, same with Asian countries, et cetera. But he doesn't do that because traditionally he's a follow-on to Pat Buchanan, who had the same thing. Pat was very good on the foreign policy, but the Republican Party doesn't want to reduce defense spending. And a lot of Democrats don't either. And most of the wars from World War II on have been really, I think, the military-industrial congressional complex has been driving those. And it drives an aggressive foreign policy. And I just don't think we can afford it anymore. And we're going to have to face that fact. I don't know when we're going to face it because they just keep spending more money on everything and that we don't take in taxes. So they're going to have to cut something. And they can certainly cut it. My budget, interestingly enough, David Stockman was here a couple of months ago, I think in October, and he said, I was watching it from my home, and he said, well, my budget, I did an analysis, and my budget comes out we could spend about 50% of what we're spending now. And that's exactly, I wrote this before this book, of course, takes a while to publish a book. I came to the same conclusion. In that book, I go through what we need, what are our vital interests, what are not our vital interests, what kind of forces we need, what type of weapons we need, and also, and then I cost them. I use Congressional Budget Office data, which is better than Pentagon data because Pentagon data understates the cost of all these things. And I come out about 50%, maybe a little less of that, right around that same number. So I don't know, maybe we're both wrong, but but at least I come out around the same way using different methods. So anyway, that's what I've got tonight. Do you have any questions or comments?
Check.
Thank you so much. So my question is, so if hypothetically, if we reduced our defense spending by the numbers you're talking about, then what would you mentioned the point of we may have to let China rise, but how would the pendulum really swing if we were to reduce our defense spending, and China is, having really trying to upset the global hegemony.
Well, I haven't seen that. I think they seem to be defending the world trading system against Trump in the United States right now. So I'm not sure they're disrupting the economics. And they've always been very commercially oriented. And I always have to laugh when they say that, China's economically penetrating this continent or that continent. But as I said before, economics goes on a different incentive structure than national security. The Chinese are trading with people, they're investing, and I'm not sure why that should be a threat to anybody. And I think we benefit. If they're subsidizing their products unfairly, it only helps our own consumers. So anytime you monkey with the market, one way or another, to try to get an advantage, you're not doing it. So in the economic sphere, they're not doing it. And I think right now they're a regional military power. Now, I just saw another study. They always have these studies that come out and say, well, China would win a war. Well, maybe, but it maybe we bought the wrong weapons. I mean, we're buying surface ships, which are very vulnerable. The aircraft carrier has more defenses than a regular ship, but the Ukrainians have done remarkable things with cheap drones against the Russian ships. So if China can win a war with us, I mean, they spend 1/4 of what we do now, roughly. And if they, even if it's a little bit more, they're hiding stuff, it's still, if we go down to 50% of what we're doing now, we're still more than China. We're still spending the most in the world on, so we're not going to be denuding ourselves. And it may be that people can beat us because they're using better weapons. Back in the 80s, I would go to the Pentagon after Israel had, I think it was in 1983 or 1982, they had used drones the first time. It became a big deal. So I went to I was at the Pentagon, and I said, well, what do we have? And they go, well, we got a lot of programs, and they're going to be much more spectacular than what the Israelis said. But I go, well, but the Israelis have them in the field, and you guys don't have anything. So, we've always been a little behind the times, I think, on drone stuff. But drones aren't everything. But right now, if we can't beat China, U.S. taxpayer ought to ask, why have we been spending what the next 10 countries do combined on defense forever? And that expertise accumulates. What have we been paying for, right? And the answer is that what Don Rumsfeld said about the defense procurement system. In fact, I was at the Pentagon when he said that the night before 9/11. I think it was 9/10/2001. He said they put out this statement from him, and he was there, and he said, well, the only thing that compares to the Soviet five-year plan is the defense five-year plan, and because he had been Secretary of Defense before, and he knew where all the bodies were buried. The weapons procurement system is a mess, and it's a shielded industry, and a lot of these new technologies just can't get out into the field because they're, because of the contractors. They build, weapons that aren't needed, or weapons that maybe have a problem in the current environment. They're not very adaptable, and it's not a free market there. And so that's one major thing we could do to improve things, get our technology into the weapons faster. But I'm not convinced that China can beat us. But I mean, we have, the other problem is we're fighting thousands of miles away. We're not fighting on our coast near Mexico or off our western coast. We have long logistics lines, which are a problem in warfare. So, that's possible. But I wonder why, if they can beat us in a war and it's so apocalyptic, then, what have the taxpayers been paying for decades? Go ahead.
Thank you very much for being here this evening. I'm Dr. Elaine Soreo, and I would like to go to a very early statement you made regarding, excuse me, also I'm doing a total blank. No. Damn it. Why am I'm doing one of those moments. Let me pass this because it is an important question, and it has to do with Ukraine and what was just stated in terms of the upcoming agreements. So.
Yeah, that's fine. We can come back.
So we're talking about the Monroe Doctrine today, but so in the recent national security strategy that just came out of the White House, it said that we're going to refocus on the Western Hemisphere, which seems like a narrowing of the Monroe Doctrine. But in that same document, it talked about strengthening the first island chain around China. So how did those two square?
Yeah.
How do you square the circle on that?
Yeah, I mentioned, it sounds good. Some of the things he's saying in practice, as general principles, and they pretty much go through the different regions of the world in the national security strategy that they just put out. But then you get to the end of it, and they're going, well, what about this problem? What about that problem? And you're going like, well, is this really going to, you're doing this is this performative that you're trying for your base? Are you trying to just do that for your base? But that's the problem. Even with people who want to be restrained militarily, there's some crisis. And ever since World War II, we were the country that, what's the U.S. going to do about it? I would like a president to say, well, we're not going to do too much, but if the countries in that particular region would like to start us off there, that would be good because we just can't keep doing this. And so I have my questions that, like you do, that this is really going to happen in practice because, as I said, Trump's not very good on implementing. But, he has good, I would say, instincts. And he's got people writing some of this stuff for him, and they have good instincts in certain respects. I don't think using military forces in the United States is a good thing at all. I'm very opposed to that. So it's in certain areas that he has good instincts, but we don't know how. As a Monroe Doctrine example, this Venezuelan thing makes no logical sense at all. I guess he's trying to threaten Maduro to get him to leave, is what he's doing. But is Maduro a real threat? Does it set a good example for the hemisphere? Most people, when you go to Latin America, most people are still very uneasy with the way the United States has behaved down there in the past. I mean, we've done some pretty heavy-handed interventions, which most Americans don't recall. So, but I think the example that you mentioned is Asia. We've done Vietnam, Korea, and we've done other interventions there. And so whether he'll be able to do that. I mean, you have pressure from the military-industrial congressional complex, I think, to do some of these things. And so even if presidents with good intentions or good rhetoric, they may not be able to do it. They may be pressured into it. Like, here's an example. It's not Asia, but Obama, he wasn't really too thrilled about going into Libya, but the French really pressured him to do so. And so he did it, and he made a mess in Libya, and we shouldn't have done it. And I think he should have followed his original instincts of doing that. But, he gets pressure from various quarters and or allies. And, I mean, what does that have to do with NATO? It doesn't have to do with our NATO ally at all, really. It's,
Thank you for your wonderful talk. Alfred Thayer Mahan made a linkage between security forces and international trade. And one of the bigger issues, at least under those theories, were that we preserved global security in order to preserve global markets. And so, and of course, the whole Marshall Plan and so many of the things we have done in the past have been to re-stabilize, if not re-established or initially establish markets for our goods. So could you tell us a little bit about how your concepts overlap with the places we export to and the largest markets we have in the world, apart from ourselves, of course, either in South America or in Europe, and how much does our security strategy still overlap in the old Mayan theory with where we want to sell goods and have open and free and preserved markets, especially, transit capabilities and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand. That view, I think, is an imperialist view, and it was stated at the time as being an imperialist view. Teddy Roosevelt, Mahan, and others at the time believed that. They also believed in the overproduction theory. And that's actually, Lenin believed the same thing about the doctrine of imperialism. And that is, capitalist countries don't consume enough that they overproduce. So then they have to get markets, and then they use imperialist tactics, mercantilist tactics, which is what using the military is to safeguard markets. It's a subsidy to business. I mean, if you take a true libertarian standpoint on some of this, and we don't, that we think it's just routine that we're over in the South China Sea, the Navy is freedom of navigation missions. Well, back when the country started, there was a big debate about whether the government should be doing that, guarding trade for the against the Barbary pirates, against the French, as I mentioned, against the British in War of 1812, et cetera. So these first wars that we had were over this issue. And really, again, it's sort of a mercantilist policy because you're subsidizing business. But you can make big money going international, but you don't have to assume any of the risk. It's riskier exporting your goods. So why shouldn't the people, the businessmen, if they're going to go international and not just export or trade here in the country, then why shouldn't they pay the cost, right? But now it's common that this is a mission for the military. And I'm not saying they should abandon that mission, but I don't think we should necessarily, one thing leads to the other, because the Vietnam War was caused by us. One of the reasons for the Vietnam War, first of all, the irrational, that the communists were going to take over all these developing countries, and it was going to snowball, which they took over some countries, but they didn't. They were all the countries that really didn't matter economically. They were very poor countries. Communism went to the poor countries rather than the countries that were wealthier. But so this idea that Japan was the linchpin of our Asian policy, and they had to get resources, manufacture the stuff, and then sell it. And that's one of the reasons that we got into Vietnam, because they wanted Southeast Asia to be a resource exporter to Japan, and Japan to be an exporter of finished goods back to the thing. So when you get into these types of things, to generalize it, when you get into all these things, well, our security depends on Japan prospering after World War II, and then, okay, then we got to go to, well, Southeast Asia. They need somebody to get resources from and export. Then you get into all sorts of things like, and there's a little book called The Pencil. I think it's called The Pencil. Anyway, it's about there are all these millions of people to make a pencil with graphite. It seems like a very graphite, wood. You get your little metal band, and then you get your eraser, right? But millions of people have to make all this stuff, and so there's an interconnected web. And that's why the focus on petroleum for security. When you securitize these things, it's usually a mask for subsidization or protectionism in one way or another. And I think that security, I'm a free trader, and I think the best thing to do is to just export. And if there are obstacles that people have to overcome, I'm not sure they should call the military. Yes.
I have it now. Thank you very much for coming back to me. I'd like to go back to an early statement you made about treaties. And this is particularly in my mind because of what has been going on in the arrangements between the U.S., the EU countries supporting Ukraine, indeed, of course, obviously, the invader of Russia. And the topic has been used that there will be a treaty. Now, this is questionable since there has been in the past commitments by the U.S. and other nations, but never in the term of a hard and fast what a treaty means. Is this just something that we're seeing a misuse of the word in the media, and there's no real discussion of a treaty, because a treaty would include the kinds of things that you presented? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that I think they may be using that term loosely, because I think there'll be some sort of agreement. Now, if we give security guarantees to Ukraine, the Congress may say, well, we need it to be a treaty, and we need a higher standard of approval, two-thirds vote in the Senate, because this is a treaty, and we're providing new security guarantees. I mean, that's what they did for NATO and other treaties in the past. But when they say treaty, they may not mean treaty. It may be an executive agreement, which is not a treaty. And they may not even have to take that. I would think they'd probably at least take something like that to Congress, but they wouldn't have a two-thirds. But you never know. I mean, some of these agreements are secret, and some of them don't go to Congress at all. So that's, that there's no executive agreement in the Constitution. Now, executive orders are a different thing. I think there's a place for those because the president is supposed to, his job is supposed to be to execute the laws. And so Congress, he can make an executive order ordering the agencies domestically to carry out the congressional laws. But when he goes out and does things when he has no constitutional authority, I think that's a big problem.
I want to come back to the Korea thing again. The UN Charter, I believe, is a treaty that we ratified. Is that correct? That's my understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So when North Korea invaded South Korea, I think we took it to the UN Security Council. And because the Russians were
Russians were gone,
boycotting the
yes.
Security Council, we got a vote from the Security Council to use troops to defend Korea. So does the UN Charter overcome the UN? I mean, is that
No.
legal?
Well, we signed up
Does our
to-
Constitution forbid us to set up a treaty that permits us, if certain, and we would have to vote for it in the Security Council because we could veto it, would that get us, is that a way of getting us into war without Congress declaring the war?
Well, Truman did it, so yeah, that was a war.
Okay,
But
so
was it legal? No.
So he says that was the legal way he did it.
Well, he did, yeah.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you have to follow the Constitution. The Constitution, the UN, we signed up to be a member of the UN. We didn't necessarily sign up to do everything what the UN wanted to do.
Well, no, but we could veto the Security Council. The Security Council can't do anything that we don't want it to do because we're the veto.
But, I mean, you have to follow the Constitution first.
Okay. Now, the other thing I want to mention, the law of the areas over there in Asia, the sea and all that. We have not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. That the United States has not ratified it. Now, we contain that's traditional international law, but our own Congress, our own Senate has not ratified that. So people have to be aware of these kinds of things when they're thinking about the Trump security strategy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They have never ratified the treaty. And there was the same thing was true with the International Criminal Court. We're not a member of that. There's some international organizations that Congress has elected not to become part of. So that's just the way it is. But, I mean, Congress has its viewpoint, and it's supposed to be the law.
President Biden, George W. Bush and President Biden both said that we would use U.S. forces to defend Taiwan from an attack by China. We have no treaty to defend Taiwan. So what they're saying is a run around our Constitution. Is that correct in your view?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Well, and Joe Biden said, I think 4 or 5 times, he blurted out, no, we're going to come to your aid. But the U.S. policy, every time his staff had to come out and say, well, our policy hasn't changed because we have a policy of ambiguity. And the reason that we do is because we don't want China, we want to deter China from invading Taiwan, but we don't want the Taiwanese to think that they can stand behind our shield and, thumb their nose at the Chinese and say, well, we want to be independent. So they're trying to, that's what the ambiguity policy, I think the ambiguity policy is wrong. I think we should just say, well, we'll sell Taiwan arms, but no, we're not going to come to your aid. And it's going to be harder for the Chinese to take over Taiwan than they think. It's very difficult. The U.S. Marines in World War II, they were island hopping Okinawa, Iwo Jima. They stayed away from Taiwan because of there's very few ports. There's the roads up in the north go to Taipei, but they can block those. There's all sorts of problems. There's not very many beaches, et cetera. And it's mountainous on the other side. And then you have all these rice paddies that they have to slog through if the Chinese get on the island. I'm not saying the Chinese can't do it, but it's going to be very difficult. And if we keep selling the Taiwanese weapons, which is what we should do, and I think I'm even for selling the Taiwanese offensive weapons so they can deter offensive missiles, so they can deter the Chinese from doing that. They can hit their bases in China. So the Taiwanese are fairly responsible countries. It's not like we're selling missiles to Iran or some of the other countries which have a bad reputation. I mean, the Taiwanese have played the game. They became a democracy, and they're a friendly country. And certainly we can sell weapons to them if they want to buy them.
I'd like you to address the concept that the Western Hemisphere is our natural area of dominance. You can't drive a car from North America to South America or ride a bicycle. They're separate continents except for a little strip of land. And
well, don't count Panama out there. You got to cross the Panama Canal.
And then we're much closer geographically to Europe than we are to most of South America. And certainly culturally, we're closer to Europe than we are to South America. Isn't our natural alliance Europe, Western Europe?
Well, we do have the Monroe Doctrine, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with that, since 1823, we've been the dominant power of the Western Hemisphere, and we had this so that European countries, the European powers, wouldn't colonize or recolonize their some of the countries that were trying to become independent in South America. But the forgotten part of the Monroe Doctrine is that we weren't supposed to get in European business. But of course, that went out the window in World War I. But I think, I say in my book, if a reasonable power like Argentina or Brazil would come up and to police that area, I would say, South America's. But I think the Caribbean and the Atlantic and the Pacific, we definitely have an interest in that. Mexico, Canada, those areas. But I think, every time World War I was the most crucial event in the 20th century because it led to World War II and everything else. And I think we shouldn't have intervened in Europe. And I don't think we should necessarily intervene every time a new regime that we don't like comes in Latin America either. So I would say, if a big power comes that has the capability to police South America, I would say fine. Let's not do it. Let's just do the Caribbean. I think we need to do the Caribbean. And Europe has the European Union that has a lot more stability than it used to have. And I think, but nevertheless, I just think that those countries with the European Union they're all very wealthy countries. I mean, to say that, Russia's going to take them over, well, you've got, 4 or 5 times the GDP of Russia. And so I don't really, and I think this idea that Putin's going to trample on he got his nose bloodied in Ukraine. I mean, his army, he had a hollow army, and it's gotten better since the fighting has started. But I still don't think they're in any mood or capability. I think they have to be very careful what they do. And I think Ukraine, they may have a slight advantage now with Ukraine, but I don't think they haven't been able to press it home. So I don't really see the threat there that other people do, I guess, from Putin. And they, even if there is a threat, they have the wherewithal to defend themselves. And I think we should go to more of if you don't want to go clear to what I say, we should at least turn more of these regional problems over to our allies to be the first line of defense at least. And if you want to go further, you can just say, the world before World War II, the world got along without us being the overweening power. And I think it can do so again. With the realism, I'm a realist, and when they say spheres of influence are out of date or balance of power is out of date, well, countries sure don't act like it. They may say that. And of course, the United States says it more than anyone, and our sphere of influence has been the whole world since World War II. And there's never been one of the things that I try to do in my book is at least throw out a plan, because nobody ever throws out a plan in DC. It's always the latest crisis. What are we going to do about this country or that country? And the answer should be Eisenhower, doing nothing is doing something, right? And so sometimes you don't need to do it, sometimes you do. But I think we're going to run into the problem of overextension, which we've had a long time, and we have these financial issues, and I don't think they're going to go away. And one of the things that you can cut back on is this foreign policy, which drains a lot of resources. But as John is the champion of it, also the hidden thing, and nobody ever talks about this in Washington, but the hidden thing is all these wars over time have eroded the republic. And we have a massive government. We have people. We have the military, a standing military. This is what the founders. Everyone always said, "Oh, the military will never do that. Our military is under control and everything. We'll never have a problem with our military here." Well, now we may not have a problem with the military. Maybe they will say these are illegal orders that they're following, but some of them won't and some of them will. And so it's, the large standing army is now a problem. And it's a problem at home now. And did we ever think that was going to happen? The framers did, but we've long forgotten it. And we didn't have a large standing army until the Korean War. After the Korean War, they didn't take it down like they usually did after most wars. And so this is a big problem. Wars really erode the fabric of a republic, and that's the biggest problem. Right in the back.
I'd like you to spin off more on this, your answer to the last question, because we're not the only major country that has its version of a Monroe Doctrine. The new strategy seeks to reassert U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere, but Russia has its interest in its near abroad, which is asserting in its own way. China certainly has its interest in its hemisphere, with Japan, with Taiwan, with its old tributary relationships. So as we pull out of NATO, dismantle our Asian alliances, and we let this kind of new world order of different Monroe alliances where major powers are asserting their own interests in their own regions. What kind of world are we moving into that you have in mind? Are we going to be safer? Are we going to have a world where we can prosper in what we had been working on building, a more integrated world economy? I mean, what kind of world are we going to move into in this plan that you're talking about?
Well, I think you can have a world that, going back to the question that we had before, I think we can have an integrated world economy without having an overweening military power to guarantee it, because it's in people's interest to trade, to have financial links. It benefits both countries, both firms, both people who are doing it, whatever level. It's all positive sum. And I'm really not sure what your military does for that. Well, we have stability. We always say we need stability. Well, that just means you're a status quo power. That may not mean that's the best routine. And of course, we had peace in Europe, relative peace, for a whole century, from the end of the Napoleonic Wars until World War I, with the balance of power. And of course, we had there were smaller wars like the Crimean War or whatever, but we had no major conflagration. So that the balance of power and the spheres of influence have worked in the past. They're not guarantees, but neither are superpower dominance either. And a lot of these countries, we dump a lot of resources into them, and did we really make them any better? I think people have to, come to democracy by themselves organically. We can't, put it in with military power. Like in Iraq, Iraq is still a mess. Afghanistan, of course, we out and out lost that war, as we did the Vietnam War. And so are we really making things better in some of these places? And certainly, I would say one country that we have really screwed up over time is Haiti. And we bear a great deal of responsibility for that country. Not all of it, but a great of it, because, and in Latin America, a lot of countries we've done that too. And so I think, we need to go a little lighter on that. And certainly we can have investment in countries and trade with countries. But I think it's a myth that this military needs to be used for stability, because war usually raises prices and interrupts supply chain and that sort of thing. And I just think naturally the trading system, and if countries don't want to, if they want to put up tariffs or they want to heavily subsidize their industries, it hurts their consumers. And nobody ever sticks up for the consumer. And that's really what we want, is we want people to consume more, so it raises the standard of living, and countries have to produce and export and that sort of thing. And I think we can have an integrated economy if we don't have people putting tariffs on or subsidizing their industries. And the leaders recognize that they're not really doing their country any good by doing that. Then I think we have a chance to do that. And I'm not sure what military, the reason I brought up the pencil thing, maybe I didn't make that clear. I mean, there's so many things that go to making a pencil. What about more AI, and what about supercomputers and quantum computing? It's whatever. There's even more people involved in that. And when you say, well, we need these rare earth metals, well, you need a lot of other things to make the thing, just like you need more than oil to keep an economy going. And so I think that it's very hard to secure every part in those supply chains, because you're just wasting your time and wasting a lot of money in doing so.
My name is Suleiman Wasti. Thank you so much. My question relates to the fashionable trend since World War II, which is carrying on proxy wars. Under the Shah of Iran, Iran was the regional hegemon, and now today we have the Greater Israel, and which has basically, with the Abraham Accords, it's basically you don't really have to go and enforce yourself, but carry on with the proxies in the region. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, I think proxy war is better than active troop involvement, but I think we have to choose our proxies very carefully, and you probably not go in, probably not. I mean, you can sell arms to people if they want to buy them, but I think we should even be careful of that if we're, because the military industry is very inefficient, and if we could reduce the defense budget, we could get rid of some of the military industry, or we could convert it to private industry, and we'd be a lot better off. But so even arms sales, I think, to certain countries, or CIA covert operations. The CIA's greatest triumph was its greatest failure. It was able to, well, supposedly, aiding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was supposed to, and some people think it tipped the entire Soviet bloc fell because of that, which I find hard to believe. But but of course it was and certainly they got the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan, so the CIA people were happy. However, then Osama bin Laden, he became a problem after that. And we got, even if we collapsed the Soviet Union, now we have a threat to the homeland. So, I mean, these things, sometimes they go wrong. If you've ever read the book, The Legacy of Ashes, about the CIA, it's title it's by a reputable journalist, Tim Weiner, and he's got a new book out too. I'm not here to pitch his book, only mine, but he, the Legacy of Ashes is pretty much, proxy, funding proxy forces, either with U.S. Special Forces or CIA. Who knows what's going to happen in these countries? I think proxies they're very hit and miss, and I'm not sure we should really be destabilizing Cuba or Venezuela. I don't particularly like either of those regimes, or Nicaragua, but are they really a threat to U.S. security? That's what you always have to come back to. When you see it on TV or wherever you see it, they're always saying, well, we got to do this or do that. Well, is it a threat to U.S. security? What's the threat to U.S. security? Is it a legitimate threat to U.S. security? And a lot of times the answer is no. So I'm not really big on proxy wars either. I suppose it's better than getting involved directly, but I'm still not for it. Yeah, Ed?
I have a couple of comments to make. You may not want to respond to them, although I'd love to talk to you.
You can arm wrestle later.
No, at the meeting. No, well, I think this will be a good basis for discussion. I think there's a real problem with not recognizing what we're dealing with when we look at China. China is a country that has twice the manufacturing capacity of the United States. GDPs are very misleading because they account all kinds of things like finance and these other activities that don't produce real capability. Healthcare, right? And for example, we also need to be clear that they may have efficiencies in manufacturing that are real, that are not just put in the form, distorted by claiming they're just government subsidies. And so they can build a frigate at 1/3 or 1/4 or even 1/5 the price that we can build a frigate. That's real. That's not finance, it's real. It's real equipment. And when we talk about a policy toward China, I always have this cartoon in my head of a mouse lecturing the gorilla, because the gorilla is China, and it is rising, and it's going to continue to rise because they have a fundamentally better system for production than we have, because we're paying all this money to these defense contractors that you and I both agree are just sucking the country dry. So So when we talk about dealing with China, we shouldn't talk about whether we're going to suppress China. We should be talking about how do we negotiate with China? How do we accommodate the Chinese in a way that's beneficial to us all? On the question of war on Taiwan, there is no doubt at all, from my personal experience, because I've had a lot of this experience in China myself, that the Chinese fully understand what a disastrous, difficult campaign would be if they tried to take Taiwan. There's no question in my mind they understand that. However, they also know that what they need to do to win, no one would win a war because they don't want to destroy Taiwan like Ukraine has been destroyed. The Chinese are pretty smart and they have a good long-term vision. But what they need to do to win again in quotes, is to deny the sea to us, to the United States. We have to control the sea to win that war because we have to project power onto the Chinese landmass and over Taiwan to help protect Taiwan. They have a navy that is not only becoming more of a blue water navy, but they have capacity in the form of submarine forces that are highly developed, that are the most advanced submarine technologies in the world. They're not nuclear, actually. They're air-independent propulsion submarines. These submarines can run havoc with a surface fleet that's trying to operate around Taiwan. And the war games show, and I think the war games are correct, that we would lose capital ships like it's going out of style. We would not win a war. They wouldn't win either because Taiwan would be destroyed, and I think they understand that. So my own view on this issue is we should tone down the rhetoric. I'm not accusing you of anything. We the Americans, the American political system, should tone down the rhetoric on this because we're creating an argument for a war that I don't think the Chinese want or will do anything that will lead to it unless we do something extremely stupid. One other thing, I'm sorry, is on the Ukraine, we should, I'll see you in the Friday, I'll show you some stuff. On the Ukraine, the military front, the Ukrainian military front has collapsed. The war is over in the Ukraine. The Russians have taken 3 critical strong points, Pokrovsk, Siversk, and Kupiansk, in the last week. They are now in a position to completely surround 14 or 15 brigades of Ukrainian forces. There's even today there's been, I follow this on a daily basis, so, because I'm nuts. And within a week or two, maybe 3 weeks, the entire eastern defensive line of Ukraine will be overtaken by the Russians. And then it will be their decision where to go from there. And I mean where to go. Will they go and take Kharkiv? Will they lay siege to Kiev? Because there are no defensive lines to speak of between them. Or will they take Odessa or Mykolaiv? This is a royal catastrophe militarily for Ukraine. And the American press, here's a discussion we ought to have in the group, is how the American press has so misinformed the American people and the public. How do we have a democracy if we don't have a press that's providing our public with accurate information? And that's one of the most serious problems that I believe our country is now facing. We have a press that's not independent. And anyway, I'll stop. So you don't need we can talk.
Well, I'll just briefly, I don't disagree with some of the stuff you're saying. I think China may be a threat to the U.S. empire, but I'm not sure it's a threat to the U.S. security of the magnitude. And part of the problem is we do have to operate thousands of miles away, and surface ships which we have our carrier-based force, centric force, the surface ships are very vulnerable to attack. And so it's possible the Chinese could win because we bought the wrong weapons. Well, yes, in a war like that, nobody wins, really, especially if you go nuclear, but even on a conventional waste. And the second thing was Ukraine. So I'd ask you the question, do you think that has resulted from the fact that Trump has kind of changed sides and has not provided some of the weapons that they need?
I don't think anything that Trump is doing has any implications for the situation on the battlefield. I think, we can talk about this in detail because he has reversed himself. His word is worthless with the Russians. The Russians, they had reached an agreement, they thought, in the Anchorage, Alaska meeting. Mm-hmm. And he's reversed himself on that several times. And all the reports that I get, that appear reliable from sources that are actually reporting the news, indicates the Russians no longer think that there's any kind of role that the United States can play in an agreement. They believe that this will be settled on the battlefield, and they are proceeding as such. So, we can talk in detail about that. I'd be happy to talk with you.
Okay.
Many of the things you brought up go all the way back to the issue of checks and balances that we started with in 1770s. And the prime example of that is the military-industrial complex, probably. So the question is, of all the things you brought up and many other things, how do we actually implement? What's the counter force to military-industrial complex and other complexes?
Well, it's very difficult because you have this with any sort of complex, any policy. You have people who want something from the government, and they're very intense in their lobbying. And then you have the general public who has to pay. The costs are diffuse. And this goes with the military-industrial complex. It goes with any subsidies that the government gives out. And the defense industrial base is grossly inefficient, and that's what's happened there. And it's very difficult. What you're getting in a real problem. How do you get rid of government, especially one where the iron triangles, like the Congress, the executive branch, in this case the military, and the industry itself, they're all lobbying for more money. And how do you get rid of that? About the only thing that you could start by opening defense subcontracting to more companies. And I think gradually it may, with a high tech, all these companies, if it's demonstrated a lot, and these drone is an example, other companies are coming in, but not fast enough, I don't think. I mean, you need more competition in the defense industry, which deals with a lot of sole source contractors and you have companies that are better at suing the government over some contract than they are in building whatever system it is, because they've been on the public dole for so long, and it's just welfare, corporate welfare, basically. And it's very difficult to do that in the defense area, but it's also difficult to do that in other areas of government, because you have these strong lobbying efforts, and the taxpayer sees the tax go up a little here and there and there and there. But there's not a groundswell of, unless you have a military crisis or whatever. But I think if you really need to cut the defense budget to cut their ability to do some of these things. Yeah, and that even the people like Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump, they never want to do that. They want a foreign policy that's not, they don't want the forever wars. But the reason the forever wars come to pass are that we have these interests, particularly after World War II. I wouldn't have said that, because the military-industrial complex didn't really occur in big time until World War II. The reason that did was because the war was so massive. It was like 44% U.S. economy was defense spending, because it was a titanic war. Not even World War I came close to that. And what happened was that you had a lot of the defense industry concentrated in the Great Lakes and on the coast. Well, what happened was that there was so much production that they started going to smaller towns, rural areas, and away from those areas toward the interior of the country. And you have so many slices of bread being buttered by this that, that we didn't go back to a smaller military after the Korean War, and the military spending didn't go back because of this. Everybody wanted, well, hey, we did pretty well during the war, so how about the Congress? How about keeping that going? Well, we really don't have a big enemy now. Well, we'll find some other way to do it. So it's very difficult. If you have any ideas, I'm happy to, happy to help. I'm not saying that sarcastically. I mean, this is a very difficult problem.
Ivan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is-